Tower. This is Delta 191 Heavy. We are encountering severe turbulence and losing altitude. Rapidly request immediate emergency assistance, Tower. Do you copy, Tower? Please respond. We have a situation here. The radio crackles with static before falling into an ominous silence that would haunt air traffic controllers for years to come. August 2nd, 1985 was supposed to be just another routine Friday afternoon at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. But what happened in those final terrifying moments would forever change how we understand one of nature's most dangerous aviation phenomena and remind us that even the most advanced aircraft can become helpless against the raw power of atmospheric fury. The summer heat was oppressive that day, with temperatures soaring above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the Texas sky painted an ominous canvas of towering thunderclouds that seemed to stretch endlessly into the heavens like dark sentinels warning of the chaos about to unfold. Delta Airlines Flight 191 began its journey that morning as a symbol of American aviation excellence, carrying 152 passengers and 11 crew members aboard a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, one of the most sophisticated wide-body aircraft of its era. Captain Edward Ted Connors Jr. was at the controls, a seasoned aviator with over 29,000 flight hours, who had navigated countless storms and challenging approaches throughout his distinguished career with Delta Airlines. First Officer Rudolph Price Jr. sat beside him, equally experienced with 7,500 flight hours under his belt, while flight engineer Nicholas Nassick completed the professional crew that passengers trusted with their lives that fateful afternoon. The aircraft itself was a marvel of 1970s engineering technology, featuring 3 powerful Rolls-Royce RB211 engines, advanced navigation systems, and a reputation for reliability that had made it a workhorse of commercial aviation across the globe. The flight had originated from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, carrying vacationers returning from summer getaways, business travelers heading to important meetings, and families reuniting with loved ones, all blissfully unaware that they were about to become part of one of the most studied and tragic accidents in aviation history. Among the passengers was a young mother traveling with her infant daughter, an elderly couple celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary, and a businessman who had changed his flight at the last minute, fate weaving its cruel tapestry as these innocent souls settled into their seats for what should have been a routine 2.5-hour journey to the heart of Texas. The morning departure had been smooth with crystal-clear skies over Florida, giving no indication of the meteorological nightmare that was brewing hundreds of miles away over the Dallas-Fort Worth metroplex. As Flight 191 cruised at 37,000 feet, the crew monitored weather reports that spoke of isolated thunderstorms in the Dallas area, nothing unusual for a Texas summer afternoon, and certainly nothing that would cause experienced pilots to consider diverting to an alternate airport. Air traffic control had been managing the complex dance of arrivals and departures all day, working around scattered storm cells that popped up like dangerous islands in an otherwise manageable traffic pattern. Captain Connors and his crew had successfully navigated similar weather countless times before relying on their training experience and the sophisticated weather radar systems that painted a picture of the storm activity ahead on their cockpit displays in green, yellow, and red pixels that represented different levels of precipitation intensity. What they could not see, however, was the invisible killer lurking within those seemingly routine summer thunderstorms, a phenomenon that meteorologists were only beginning to understand, and one that would claim 137 lives before scientists and aviation authorities would fully comprehend its devastating potential. The microburst, a sudden, violent downdraft of air that could exceed 6,000 feet per minute in descent rate, was nature's perfect storm, a meteorological assassin that could appear without warning and disappear just as quickly, leaving destruction in its wake. These localized columns of descending air would hit the ground and spread outward in all directions, creating wind shear conditions so severe that even the most powerful aircraft could be overwhelmed in a matter of seconds, transformed from graceful flying machines into helpless victims of atmospheric violence. The approach to Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport began normally with air traffic control clearing Flight 191 for the standard arrival procedure to runway 17. Left a routine approach that Captain Connors had flown dozens of times before. The massive airport sprawled across the Texas prairie like a modern marvel of aviation infrastructure, its multiple runways capable of handling the largest aircraft in the world, while its sophisticated radar and communication systems guided hundreds of Flights safely to their destinations every single day. The passengers were finishing their in-flight meals, reading magazines or gazing out the windows at the patchwork of suburban neighborhoods and shopping centers that marked their approach to one of America's busiest aviation hubs, completely unaware that they were descending toward an appointment with destiny that would be measured not in minutes, but in seconds. At 6:02 p.m. local time, Delta Flight 191 was cleared to descend to 3,000 feet and contact the approach controller, a routine handoff that had been performed thousands of times before, without incident. Captain Connors acknowledged the clearance with the professional calm that comes from years of experience, while First Officer Price monitored the aircraft systems and prepared for what appeared to be a straightforward approach, despite the visible thunderstorm activity in the area. The weather radar in the cockpit showed cells of precipitation, but nothing that appeared immediately threatening to the approach path they had been assigned by air traffic control. Flight engineer Nasik ran through his pre-landing checklist, ensuring that all systems were configured properly for arrival, while 152 passengers and cabin crew members prepared for touchdown, blissfully unaware that they were about to encounter a force of nature that would test the very limits of human engineering and aviation safety protocols. The first indication that something was terribly wrong came at 6:05 p.m. when Flight 191 encountered the outer edges of the storm cell as they descended through 1,500 feet above the ground. The aircraft began to shake violently as it penetrated walls of rain so intense that visibility dropped to near zero, while lightning illuminated the cockpit in strobing flashes that revealed the concern growing on the faces of the experienced flight crew. Captain Connors fought to maintain control as the TriStar bucked and rolled through the turbulence, each movement of the controls requiring tremendous physical strength, as the aircraft seemed to develop a mind of its own in the grip of the storm. Passengers who had been calmly reading or chatting moments before now gripped their armrests with white knuckles as flight attendants struggled to remain standing while trying to reassure everyone that turbulence was normal, even as their own faces betrayed the fear that this was anything but routine. The cockpit voice recorder captured the growing tension in the voices of the crew as Captain Connors called for increased power from the engines, while First Officer Price monitored their airspeed and altitude with growing concern. The aircraft was being buffeted by winds that seemed to come from every direction at once, while rain hammered against the windscreen with such intensity that the wipers could not keep up, leaving the pilots flying almost completely on instruments as they tried to maintain the approach path to runway 17 left. Lightning strikes illuminated the storm clouds around them in brilliant flashes that revealed the towering heights of the cumulonimbus cells they were penetrating, while thunder crashed so loudly that it could be heard over the roar of the three powerful engines that were straining to maintain the approach speed. At 6:05:44 p.m., the situation deteriorated catastrophically as Flight 191 encountered the core of the microburst, a column of air descending at over 4,000 feet per minute that struck the aircraft like an invisible hammer from above. The sudden downdraft overwhelmed the lift generated by the wings, while simultaneously creating wind shear conditions that changed the aircraft's effective airspeed by more than 40 knots in a matter of seconds. Captain Connors immediately recognized the danger and called for maximum power from all three engines, while pulling back on the controls in a desperate attempt to arrest the rapid descent that was driving them toward the ground at an alarming rate. The flight data recorder would later reveal that the crew did everything correctly, following their training and procedures perfectly, but they were fighting a battle against physics itself as the invisible microburst continued to push them downward with irresistible force. First Officer Price's voice became increasingly urgent as he called out altitudes and airspeeds that were deteriorating rapidly despite the crew's best efforts to recover from the situation. The aircraft was losing altitude at over 5,000 feet per minute, while the airspeed fluctuated wildly between dangerously slow and impossibly fast as the wind shear created conditions that no aircraft had ever been designed to handle. Flight engineer Nasik monitored engine parameters that showed all three power plants operating at maximum capacity, yet unable to provide enough thrust to overcome the downdraft that held them in its deadly grip. The passengers could feel the aircraft descending rapidly with their stomachs rising into their throats, while the sound of the engines screaming at maximum power filled the cabin with a noise that spoke of machinery being pushed far beyond its design limits. The final moments of Flight 191 unfolded with terrifying speed as the massive TriStar descended below the normal glide path, while Captain Connors fought desperately to maintain control. The aircraft struck the ground first at a point approximately 6,000 feet short of the runway threshold, hitting a car on State Highway 114 and killing the driver instantly before bouncing back into the air for a few precious seconds that offered false hope of a miraculous recovery. The impact with the automobile sent debris flying in all directions, while the landing gear was torn away and fuel began streaming from ruptured tanks, creating a trail of combustible liquid that would soon become part of the inferno that was about to engulf the aircraft. Witnesses on the ground watched in horror as the massive jetliner appeared to bounce off the highway like a skipping stone, each impact sending up showers of sparks and debris, while the screaming engines continued their futile attempt to generate enough lift to carry the aircraft to safety. The final impact came just seconds later, as Flight 191 struck a water tank on the airport perimeter before sliding across the ground in a shower of sparks and twisted metal that would be etched forever in the memories of rescue workers and investigators who rushed to the scene. The aircraft broke apart on impact with the forward fuselage separating from the wings, while fuel ignited in a massive fireball that engulfed the wreckage and sent thick black smoke billowing into the stormy Texas sky. The force of the impact and the subsequent fire would ultimately claim 137 lives, including all 11 crew members and 126 of the 152 passengers, while miraculously 25 passengers survived the crash, though many would carry physical and emotional scars for the rest of their lives. Emergency responders arrived within minutes of the crash, but were initially driven back by the intense heat and toxic smoke that made rescue operations extremely dangerous, while they watched helplessly as the aircraft was consumed by flames. The investigation that followed would become one of the most comprehensive and important studies in aviation history, as the National Transportation Safety Board worked to understand exactly what had caused this tragedy and how similar accidents could be prevented in the future. Investigators discovered that Flight 191 had encountered a microburst, a phenomenon that was poorly understood at the time and for which no adequate detection or recovery procedures existed in commercial aviation. The microburst created wind shear conditions so severe that no aircraft could have successfully recovered once caught in its grip, while the crew's response had been textbook perfect, according to the training and procedures available at the time. The accident would lead to revolutionary changes in weather detection technology, crew training procedures, and aircraft certification standards that would save countless lives in the decades to come. The families of the victims faced the unimaginable task of grieving for loved ones who had died in what should have been a routine flight, while struggling to understand how such a tragedy could occur with an experienced crew flying a sophisticated aircraft in weather that appeared manageable. Memorial services were held across the country as communities came together to mourn the loss of parents, children, spouses, and friends whose lives had been cut short by forces beyond human control. The crew of Flight 191 was posthumously recognized for their professional response to an impossible situation, while investigators praised their adherence to proper procedures, even in the face of certain death. Captain Connors, First Officer Price, and Flight Engineer Nassick had done everything right, yet were powerless against the invisible enemy that had claimed their aircraft and their lives. The legacy of Delta Flight 191 extends far beyond the tragic loss of life on that stormy August evening, as the accident became a catalyst for revolutionary improvements in aviation safety technology and procedures. The development of terminal Doppler weather radar systems at major airports now provides air traffic controllers and pilots with real-time detection of microburst activity, allowing flights to be diverted or delayed until dangerous conditions pass. Enhanced wind shear detection and warning systems became mandatory equipment on commercial aircraft, while new training procedures teach pilots how to recognize and recover from wind shear encounters before they become unrecoverable situations. The certification standards for new aircraft now include specific requirements for wind shear penetration capabilities, while approach procedures have been modified to provide better escape routes when severe weather threatens airport operations. Today, as you board your next flight and feel that brief moment of anxiety during turbulence, or as you watch storm clouds gather on the horizon, remember the crew and passengers of Delta Flight 191, who gave their lives so that we could learn from their
tragedy
and make flying safer for everyone who follows. Their sacrifice led directly to technologies and procedures that have prevented countless similar accidents, while their memory serves as a constant reminder that aviation safety requires eternal vigilance and continuous improvement. The microburst that claimed Flight 191 was an invisible killer that struck without warning, but thanks to the lessons learned from this tragedy, we now have the tools to see these atmospheric assassins coming and the knowledge to avoid their deadly embrace. If this story has moved you or taught you something new about aviation safety, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth investigations into the accidents that have shaped modern aviation. Share this video with others who might be interested in learning about the real stories behind aviation headlines and help us honor the memory of those who have given their lives to make flying safer for all of us. The families of Flight 191's victims deserve to have their loved ones remembered, not just as statistics in an accident report, but as real people whose lives had meaning and whose deaths led to improvements that continue to save lives today. Together we can ensure that the lessons learned from tragedies like this one are never forgotten, and that the progress towards safer skies continues for future generations of travelers who place their trust in the miracle of flight. The morning of August 2, 1985 had begun like any other summer day in South Florida, with passengers arriving at Fort Lauderdale-Hollywood International Airport carrying vacation memories, sunburned shoulders, and the satisfied exhaustion that comes from days spent under the tropical sun. The departure gate buzzed with the familiar sounds of commercial aviation families saying goodbye to relatives, business travelers, checking their watches, and flight attendants preparing for another routine service aboard one of Delta Airlines' most reliable aircraft. Captain Edward Connors had arrived early that morning, as was his habit, reviewing weather reports, flight plans, and the technical specifications of the Lockheed L-1011 TriStar that would carry his passengers safely to their destination in Texas. His methodical approach to flight preparation had served him well throughout nearly 3 decades of commercial aviation, during which he had earned the respect of colleagues and the trust of passengers who never knew his name but depended on his expertise every time they stepped aboard his aircraft. The TriStar itself was a technological marvel, representing the pinnacle of 1970s aerospace engineering, with its distinctive S-duct inlet for the rear-mounted engine, advanced autopilot systems, and spacious passenger cabin that could accommodate up to 400 travelers in comfort and safety. Registration number N726DA had been delivered to Delta Airlines in 1973 and had accumulated thousands of flight hours crisscrossing the American continent without a single significant incident, a testament to both the robust design of the Lockheed engineers and the meticulous maintenance procedures that kept the aircraft in peak operating condition. The 3 Rolls-Royce RB211 engines that powered the massive jetliner were among the most reliable power plants ever created for commercial aviation, each capable of producing over 4,000 pounds of thrust, while maintaining fuel efficiency that made long-range flights economically viable for airlines and passengers alike. First Officer Rudolph Price had joined the crew that morning, bringing his own wealth of experience and professional dedication to the flight deck, where he would serve as Captain Connor's right hand during the journey ahead. Price had dreamed of becoming an airline pilot since childhood, spending countless hours building model airplanes and reading aviation magazines, while other children played with toys that would never lift them above the mundane concerns of earthbound existence. His path to the cockpit of a major airline had required years of training, military service flight instruction, and gradual advancement through smaller carriers, before finally earning his place at Delta Airlines, where he could fulfill his lifelong ambition of flying passengers safely across the vast American continent. Flight engineer Nicholas Nassick completed the professional crew, bringing specialized knowledge of aircraft systems that would prove crucial during the normal operations of the complex TriStar, and tragically inadequate against the forces they would soon encounter over Texas. The passenger manifest for Flight 191 read like a cross-section of American life in the mid-1980s, representing dreams, aspirations, family connections, and business obligations that had brought together 152 individuals who shared nothing more than a common destination and a trust in the aviation system that had become as routine as taking a city bus. Among them was Melody Freese, a young mother traveling with her 11-month-old daughter, Sabrina, returning to Texas after visiting family in Florida, completely unaware that she was about to become part of a story that would be studied by aviation experts for decades to come. Ruben and Emma Malossi, an elderly couple from New York, were celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary with a vacation that had taken them through several states as they revisited places where they had honeymooned 4 decades earlier, when commercial aviation was still in its infancy and cross-country travel required multiple stops and careful planning. The business travelers aboard Flight 191 represented the mobile workforce of the Reagan-era economy, carrying briefcases filled with contracts, proposals, and presentations that would never be delivered while their families waited at home for phone calls that would never come. Among them were salesmen returning from client meetings, engineers heading to project sites, and managers traveling between corporate facilities, all of them confident that the sophisticated transportation system would deliver them safely to their Monday morning obligations. The vacation passengers included families returning from Disney World visits, grandparents who had spent precious time with grandchildren, and retirees who were finally able to explore the country they had worked so hard to build during their productive careers. Each passenger represented a network of relationships that would be forever altered by the events of the next few hours, creating ripples of grief that would spread far beyond the immediate families into communities across the nation. The departure from Fort Lauderdale proceeded with textbook precision as Captain Connors guided the massive TriStar away from the gate through the maze of taxiways and onto the active runway where the 3 powerful engines spooled up to take off power with a sound that never failed to inspire awe in those who witnessed it. The acceleration down the runway pressed passengers back into their seats as 400,000 pounds of aircraft passengers, cargo, and fuel gathered speed until the laws of aerodynamics finally overcame gravity and lifted them into the clear Florida sky. The initial climb took them over the Everglades, where alligators sunned themselves on muddy banks, completely indifferent to the human drama passing overhead, while passengers gazed down at a landscape that seemed to stretch endlessly toward horizons, shimmering in the summer heat. As Flight 191 reached its cruising altitude of 37,000 feet, the cabin settled into the familiar rhythm of a long-distance flight, with passengers reading newspapers, playing cards, or simply gazing out windows at cloud formations that drifted below them, like cotton balls scattered across a blue tablecloth. The flight attendants began their service routine, offering drinks and snacks, while engaging in the small talk that helps pass time during the long hours between takeoff and landing. Children pressed their faces against windows, marveling at the miniature world below, while adults tried to identify cities, highways, and geographical features that marked their progress across the southeastern United States. The cockpit crew monitored instruments, flight plans, and weather reports that painted a picture of routine summer conditions ahead, with scattered thunderstorms reported in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, nothing that would cause experienced pilots to alter their plans or consider diverting to alternate airports. The science of meteorology in 1985 was advanced enough to track large weather systems, predict general patterns, and issue warnings for severe conditions, but the microscale phenomena that could destroy aircraft in seconds remained largely invisible to both ground-based radar systems and the weather detection equipment carried aboard commercial aircraft. Microbursts were known to exist, but their formation, dissipation, and intensity patterns were poorly understood, while detection methods were primitive compared to the sophisticated systems that would be developed in the wake of this tragedy. The National Weather Service could track thunderstorm cells, predict tornado formation, and issue warnings for damaging winds. But the localized columns of descending air that created wind shear conditions remained hidden within larger storm systems like assassins waiting in ambush for unsuspecting aircraft attempting to land at airports throughout the country. The meteorological conditions developing over North Texas that afternoon were creating the perfect environment for microburst formation as hot, humid air from the Gulf of Mexico collided with cooler, drier air masses moving down from the northern plains. The resulting instability generated towering cumulonimbus clouds that reached heights of over 5,000 feet, while their internal structure remained invisible to conventional radar systems that could detect precipitation, but not the violent air currents that accompanied it. Within these seemingly routine summer thunderstorms, columns of air were descending at velocities that exceeded anything that aircraft had been designed to handle, while their horizontal spread upon reaching the ground created wind patterns that could overwhelm even the most powerful engines and sophisticated flight control systems. Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport had been designed as a model of modern aviation infrastructure when it opened in 1974, featuring multiple runways, sophisticated navigation aids, and weather monitoring systems that represented the state-of-the-art in airport technology. The massive facility sprawled across 17,000 acres of Texas prairie, making it larger than the island of Manhattan, while its parallel runway system could handle simultaneous operations that kept traffic moving efficiently even during peak travel periods. Air traffic controllers working in the gleaming tower had managed thousands of arrivals and departures through summer thunderstorms, relying on their training experience and the radar systems that painted weather echoes on their screens in various shades of green, yellow, and red intensity. What they could not see, however, were the invisible downdrafts that were forming within those routine storm cells, creating conditions that would turn a normal approach into a fight for survival. The approach control facility at Dallas-Fort Worth monitored incoming traffic with military precision as controllers vectored dozens of aircraft around weather cells toward their assigned runways, while maintaining safe separation and efficient traffic flow. Flight 191 appeared on their radar screens as just another routine arrival from Florida, joining the steady stream of aircraft approaching from all directions as the afternoon rush began to build toward its peak intensity. The weather radar showed scattered cells of precipitation moving through the area, but nothing that appeared to pose an immediate threat to operations, while the airport remained open with all runways available for arriving traffic. Controllers had successfully managed similar conditions hundreds of times before working around weather, with the skill that comes from years of experience and the confidence that modern technology provided adequate tools for maintaining safety, even in challenging conditions. At 6:02 p.m. local time, Delta Flight 191 established contact with Dallas Approach Control, beginning a conversation that would be preserved forever on air traffic control recordings, as a testament to the professional competence of both pilots and controllers who followed established procedures perfectly while confronting forces that no one fully understood at the time. Captain Connors acknowledged vectors and altitude assignments with the calm professionalism that passengers had come to expect from airline crews, while First Officer Price monitored instruments and prepared for what appeared to be a straightforward approach, despite the visible thunderstorm activity in the area. The routine nature of the radio communications gave no indication of the drama that was about to unfold, as Flight 191 descended toward an appointment with meteorological conditions that would test every aspect of their training experience and the aircraft systems they trusted to keep them alive. The passengers remained blissfully unaware of the complex choreography taking place in the cockpit, as their pilots navigated through increasingly challenging weather conditions while maintaining the professional calm that is the hallmark of commercial aviation. Some passengers noticed the aircraft beginning to encounter turbulence as it descended through layers of unstable air, while others continued reading or dozing, completely trusting in the competence of the crew and the reliability of the aircraft systems. Flight attendants began preparing the cabin for landing, checking that seat belts were fastened, tray tables were stowed, and carry-on items were properly secured, while their own experience told them that the increasing turbulence was probably nothing more than the routine bumps that accompany approaches through summer thunderstorms in Texas. The cockpit voice recorder captured the growing concern in the voices of the flight crew as they penetrated deeper into the storm system, while struggling to maintain visual contact with the runway environment through rain so intense that it overwhelmed the aircraft windscreen wipers. Captain Connors called for approach flaps and landing gear, while First Officer Price monitored airspeed and altitude, with increasing attention to instruments that were beginning to show the first signs of the atmospheric violence they were about to encounter. Flight engineer Nasick ran through landing checklists while monitoring engine parameters that remained normal despite the turbulence that was beginning to shake the massive aircraft, like a toy in the hands of an angry child. Lightning strikes illuminated the cockpit in brief, brilliant flashes that revealed expressions of professional concentration rather than panic as the crew worked together to penetrate weather conditions that thousands of flights had navigated successfully before. The microburst that would claim Flight 191 had been forming within the thunderstorm for several minutes as superheated air high in the atmosphere suddenly cooled and began descending toward the ground with increasing velocity and destructive power. This invisible column of death measured perhaps 2,000 feet in diameter, while containing downdrafts that exceeded 6,000 feet per minute in some areas, creating a localized weather phenomenon more dangerous than tornadoes, hurricanes, or any other atmospheric condition that aircraft might encounter during normal operations. The microburst struck the ground and spread outward in all directions like water from a garden hose, creating a pattern of divergent winds that could cause aircraft to experience simultaneous headwinds and tailwinds while fighting downdrafts that no amount of engine power could overcome. At 6:05:44 p.m. Central Daylight Time, Flight 191 entered the core of the microburst while configured for landing and committed to the approach with insufficient altitude or airspeed to execute a successful escape maneuver. The initial encounter with the downdraft caused the aircraft to descend rapidly, while the crew immediately recognized the danger and began executing wind shear recovery procedures that had been developed based on limited understanding of the phenomenon they were fighting. Captain Connors called for maximum power from all three engines, while simultaneously pulling back on the flight controls, in an attempt to arrest the descent that was driving them toward the ground at an alarming rate. The flight data recorder would later show that the engines responded immediately to the power demand, but the thrust they generated was insufficient to overcome the downdraft that held the aircraft in its deadly grip. First Officer Price called out altitude and airspeed information with increasing urgency as the aircraft descended through decision height, while the crew fought desperately to regain control of a situation that was deteriorating with frightening speed. The sophisticated flight management systems aboard the TriStar provided continuous information about their predicament, but offered no solutions to the physical forces that were overwhelming the aircraft, despite the heroic efforts of the crew who were following their training perfectly while confronting conditions that no training could adequately prepare them to handle. Flight engineer Nasik monitored engine instruments that showed all three power plants operating at maximum capacity, while fuel flow indicators climbed to levels that would normally be associated with takeoff power settings rather than approach configurations. The passengers felt the aircraft shaking violently as it penetrated walls of rain and hail, while lightning strikes created brilliant flashes that illuminated the cabin through window shades that could not block the intensity of the electrical activity surrounding them. The sound of the engines screaming at maximum power filled the passenger compartment with a noise that spoke of machinery being pushed far beyond normal operating parameters, while the rapid descent caused stomachs to rise and ears to pop from the sudden altitude changes. Flight attendants struggled to remain upright while trying to reassure passengers that turbulence was normal, even as their own training told them that this encounter was far more severe than anything they had experienced in their careers with the airline. The final approach to Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport became a desperate battle between human-skill aircraft technology and the raw power of atmospheric physics, as Captain Connors and his crew fought to maintain control while descending through conditions that challenged every assumption about aircraft performance and weather penetration capabilities. The massive TriStar was being subjected to forces that exceeded its design limitations, while the crew exhausted every technique in their repertoire of recovery procedures without achieving the results that training had led them to expect. Wind shear warnings that would become standard equipment on commercial aircraft within a few years of this accident did not exist in 1985, leaving pilots to recognize and respond to these invisible killers using only their experience, intuition, and the basic flight instruments that provided information but no specific guidance for microburst encounters. The ground proximity warning system began sounding its urgent alerts as Flight 191 descended below the normal approach path, while Captain Connors maintained maximum power and continued pulling back on the controls in a final desperate attempt to clear the obstacles that lay ahead. The sophisticated terrain avoidance system that would become mandatory equipment in later years existed only in the imagination of engineers who were working to develop technologies that could prevent exactly this type of accident. Air traffic controllers watching the flight on their radar screens could see that something was wrong, but lacked the tools to provide specific guidance about wind conditions that were invisible to their ground-based systems, while the crew fought their lonely battle against forces that no ground observer could fully comprehend. The impact sequence began at 6:05:52 p.m. when Flight 191 struck the ground approximately 6,000 feet short of runway 17. left hitting a Toyota Celica occupied by William Mayberry, who was driving north on State Highway 114, completely unaware that a commercial airliner was about to fall from the sky directly into his path. The collision killed Mayberry instantly while destroying the aircraft landing gear and rupturing fuel tanks that began streaming jet fuel across the highway in a trail of combustible liquid that would soon ignite in a massive fireball. The impact with the automobile sent the TriStar bouncing back into the air for approximately 100 feet, giving false hope to witnesses who thought the crew might still be able to execute a miraculous recovery and reach the safety of the airport runway system. The final impact occurred seconds later as the aircraft struck two 40-foot-tall water tanks on the airport perimeter before sliding across the ground in a shower of sparks, twisted metal, and aviation fuel that ignited almost immediately upon contact with hot engine components and electrical systems. The massive jetliner broke apart during the ground impact sequence, with the cockpit and forward fuselage separating from the wing and passenger cabin sections, while the three engines continued to operate for several seconds after the crash, creating a surreal scene of technological persistence in the midst of absolute destruction. Emergency responders who had been alerted by air traffic control arrived within minutes of the accident, but were initially driven back by intense heat, toxic smoke, and the possibility of additional explosions as thousands of gallons of jet fuel continued to burn in a conflagration that could be seen for miles across the North Texas landscape. The human toll of Delta Flight 191 extended far beyond the immediate victims, as families across the nation received phone calls that would forever divide their lives into before and after, while communities struggled to comprehend how such a tragedy could occur in an era when commercial aviation had achieved unprecedented levels of safety and reliability. The 25 survivors who managed to escape the burning wreckage would carry physical and emotional scars for the remainder of their lives, while the families of the 137 victims faced the impossible task of rebuilding their existence around voids that could never be filled. Emergency rooms at area hospitals worked through the night, treating survivors whose injuries ranged from minor burns to life-threatening trauma, while counselors began the long process of helping people process grief that defied understanding or easy acceptance. The investigation launched by the National Transportation Safety Board would ultimately involve hundreds of experts, meteorologists, engineers, and aviation professionals who worked for months to understand exactly what had happened to Flight 191 and why the most advanced aircraft and crew training of the era had proved inadequate against the forces they encountered. Investigators discovered that the microburst phenomenon was far more common and dangerous than previously understood, while existing detection methods were completely inadequate for identifying these invisible killers that could appear and disappear within minutes of their formation. The accident report would run to hundreds of pages while recommending sweeping changes in weather detection technology, crew training procedures, aircraft certification standards, and airport operations that would fundamentally transform the way the aviation industry dealt with severe weather conditions. The technological revolution that followed the Delta 191 accident included the development of terminal Doppler weather radar systems that could detect wind patterns within thunderstorms with unprecedented accuracy while providing real-time information about microburst activity to air traffic controllers and pilots. These sophisticated systems cost millions of dollars to install and operate, but their ability to save lives by providing early warning of dangerous conditions justified the investment while establishing new standards for weather detection at major airports throughout the United States. Enhanced ground proximity warning systems became mandatory equipment on commercial aircraft, while wind shear detection and alert systems provided pilots with specific information about atmospheric conditions that could threaten their aircraft during critical phases of flight. The training revolution that emerged from the lessons of Flight 191 included comprehensive programs that taught pilots how to recognize the early signs of micro-burst encounters while providing specific techniques for escape and recovery that had been developed through extensive flight simulation and wind tunnel testing. These training programs acknowledged that some microburst encounters might be unrecoverable regardless of crew skill or aircraft performance, while emphasizing the importance of early recognition and immediate response to maximize the chances of survival. Flight simulator manufacturers developed new training scenarios that could replicate the conditions encountered by Flight 191, allowing pilots to practice emergency procedures in a safe environment while building the muscle memory and decision-making skills that could prove crucial during actual encounters with severe weather. The regulatory changes that followed included new certification standards for commercial aircraft that required specific performance capabilities during wind shear encounters, while mandating equipment that could provide pilots with real-time information about atmospheric conditions. Approach procedures at major airports were modified to provide better escape routes when severe weather threatened, while air traffic control procedures were enhanced to give controllers better tools for managing traffic around dangerous weather systems. The Federal Aviation Administration worked closely with aircraft manufacturers, airlines, and pilot organizations to ensure that the lessons learned from Delta 191 would be incorporated into every aspect of commercial aviation operations, while establishing new safety margins that acknowledged the reality of microburst encounters. The memorial services held for the victims of Flight 191 brought together communities from across the nation as people struggled to find meaning in a tragedy that seemed to defy rational explanation, while honoring the memory of those whose lives had been cut short by forces beyond human control. Captain Connor's First Officer Price and Flight Engineer Nassik were posthumously recognized for their professional response to an impossible situation, while the passenger victims were remembered not as statistics in an accident report, but as real people whose lives had touched countless others in ways that extended far beyond the immediate circle of family and friends. The crew of Flight 191 had done everything right according to the training and procedures available at the time, yet were powerless against an invisible enemy that would claim their lives and the lives of those who had trusted them to deliver them safely to their destination. Today, when you board a commercial aircraft and notice the sophisticated weather radar displays in the cockpit or hear announcements about wind shear detection systems, remember the crew and passengers of Delta Flight 191 whose sacrifice made these safety improvements possible, while serving as a constant reminder that aviation safety requires eternal vigilance and continuous improvement. The microburst that claimed Flight 191 was an invisible assassin that struck without warning, but thanks to the lessons learned from this tragedy, we now have the tools to detect these atmospheric killers before they can claim more victims, while the knowledge to avoid their deadly embrace has been incorporated into every aspect of modern commercial aviation operations.